Our young people today, in campuses especially, stand precisely at this crossroads. I know what it's like to be in a culture and to be a contrarian. I went through this through my undergraduate days, my graduate days, and I became something of a persona non grata in many parts of the Reform movement. Not that I didn't have very cogent reasons for the things that I thought, but because there was an ideological wall or tower, as it were, and to speak against that wall and that tower was to break from the herd thinking. And Rav and I have had this our entire lives of what it meant to pursue our truth. And if detractors have something to say it reasonably, let us understand it, but we have to seek this out. So, and many of you have lived the same way. Many of you have thought things and done things that set you apart, and you can make a case for it. You can reason your way through it. And what you're realizing is you're fighting against the Tower of Babel. You're not fighting against reason. You're fighting against assumptions, biases, unexamined premises, one stacked on top of the other. And there you are trying to find your way out of, as it were, Ur-Kasdim, and find your way onto Canaan. Canaan here being our metaphor for what it means to search something that is good and right and true. So I want us to bring back to the work that we are doing here. It's very grievous to me that we are in a war. And I want to share something very deep with you. I'm one of that generation of people who grew up around World War II veterans. And there's a joke about people like me. Kids ask, why is your father always studying World War II? And the joke is that we believe there's an entrance exam when we die to get into heaven, and it's going to be all the trivia of World War II, because they see us studying it so carefully. It's become kind of a joke. Well, I'll tell you why I study it. Because I study the parts of the Second World War where everything was at stake. There were a few moments in the Second World War when it came down to very small units of people who held the line and turned back the tide, especially in 1942. And I read about those people, and I and you know some of their names. Most people don't. In fact, most people actually don't know what total war is. So for a generation of people who've never studied the history of the Second World War, and I want to focus now on Imperial Japan, because the kinds of things that Hamas has done, torturing people, cutting fetuses out of women, stabbing fetuses, shooting women as they watch their own child being stabbed, putting people in slaughterhouses and making them watch each other if they were slaughtering them. We have documentation. This is what the Japanese Empire did to the Chinese. Most people don't know. In the Sino-Japanese War, scholars differ. 20 million Chinese died in the Sino-Japanese War, 1937 to 1945. Much of that due to murderous Japanese policies toward the Chinese and intentional slaughterings of tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. I'm going to guess you don't know about this, because who goes back and studies the Sino-Japanese War of 1937 to 1945? I also want you to know the Japanese were intended on keeping China till the very end and continuing their massacres and their slave labor camps and the depredations and the rape and the torture. In fact, the Japanese Empire was at its height in China in 1944. Why did we have to win that war? We had to win the war for many reasons, but number one, so that empire would not rule half the planet. You don't know how bad it was until you go decide. Then the question is, what did we have to do to win that war? Now, I want you to know in the summer of 1945, after the Battle of Iwo Jima, after the Battle of Okinawa, here's what the Japanese High Command said. We will sacrifice our entire nation, but we will not surrender. If you try to invade our island and get rid of the Imperial Japanese Army and their utterly racist and brutal depredations against people, including American prisoners of war, Filipino prisoners of war, it is more atrocious than you can possibly imagine. What they said is, every single one of us will die, but we will not surrender. You send Americans in here, there'll be one Japanese for one American. We were facing losing 1 million soldiers dying in the summer of 1945. And we made a decision to win the war. Of course, there were huge civilian casualties. But we had a choice to make. Do we let Imperial Japan continue to exist, including their huge army in China, or do we win the war? Now, we're not used to thinking that way. We're not used to. We people who grew up after 1945, we don't know what it was like to have to defeat Germany because the SS was still murdering people all the way up until the day of the surrender on May 9th, 1945. I want you to understand this. The SS was still murdering people until the day the German High Command surrendered. They had to be defeated. And when you look at what the civilian casualties in Germany and Japan that their regimes were willing to absorb in order not to surrender, it put our military, I'm going to speak about our military, because we have a moral military, no matter what anybody else in the world says. If you want to fight a war against somebody, fight against America, not the Russians, not the Soviets, not the Germans, not the Japanese, because we are the most just military in the history of the planet. Can you imagine what the American soldiers felt when they were bombing Japanese cities, bombing German cities, bombing into submission because we had to win those wars? That's what we are in now. I grieve civilian casualties, but I don't want a quasi-state to exist like ISIS that has the same values of the Japanese Empire, of Nazi Germany, which is built in murder, depredation, atrocities, and rape. It can't continue. So if anybody says to you, what about the Gaza civilians? This is the first point I want to make. I feel terrible about them. If anybody has a better idea on how to defeat Hamas, we're all ears. But unfortunately, if we look at Nazi Germany, if we look at Imperial Japan, if we look at ISIS, they don't surrender because they don't care about their people. They don't care about their people. The minute the Gazans surrender Hamas, the bombing will stop. It's not the fault of the Israelis that were bombing their cities. It's their fault. They brought this war upon them, and from the more I've been studying, it seems that Gaza was entirely behind Hamas. I used to believe there's the innocent Gazans and the evil Hamas. It does not seem to be the case. This seems to be people united behind Hamas, just as Germans were united behind Nazi Germany and the Japanese were united behind Japan. This is terrible. This is tragic. It gives me no joy to describe things as they are, but I can go back to history. Now, what about us here? So the main point there I want to share with you is Israel is in a war. And this is not the war where they lob over a few hundred rockets and Israel makes an incursion and they take a few hostages that sit there for 7-8 years. This is not that war. This is where they've slaughtered 1,000 people, and they would have slaughtered another 1,000 and another 1,000 and another 1,000 and another 1,000 if they could have. They intended to hold land for 3 days. They came in with rations and provisions. They thought they could hold the Israeli army up. I want you to understand, if their original plan worked, it would not have been 1,000 Israeli killed. It would have been 5,000 or more slaughtered. There would not be 288 hostages. There'd be maybe more than 1,000, 2,000 hostages if they had succeeded. That was their plan. And because of the incredible valor of what I would call Israeli Minutemen, men and women who were nearby and went down and sacrificed their lives and turned that evil tide back. That's why the casualties on the Israel side were only, as it were, 1,000 people slaughtered, and only, as it were, 300 people taken hostage. If they had not been stopped, it would be much worse. Now, I'm going to ask you, I want you to think about this clearly. What if someone had called for a ceasefire on the afternoon of October 7th? Do you think Hamas would have observed a ceasefire? What if they would have been slaughtering and murdering October 7th and 8th and 9th? Do you think they would have had a ceasefire? You think they would have backed off? They would have murdered until the last moment. That's what we're facing here. They will not give up. They intend to murder Israelis. And by the way, if you've heard their speeches in their mosques, to murder every Jew in the world, that means you. That means us here. And then every American in the world. We might suffer terrible terror attacks here, like 9/11. They're unrelenting. This is Al-Qaeda and ISIS state rolled into one, backed by Iran, further backed by Russia and China that want to destabilize our world. This is very serious. Now, we have to take care of our lives. We have to take care of each other. We have to deepen our love for each other. But on the other hand, we have been brought into something which is horrible. And horrible things are going to happen, but we can fight. And that's my topics for tonight and tomorrow. What can we do? What we're aware of is there's a generation of people, because they have no recollection of Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. They don't fully understand the genocides in Rwanda, where, by the way, these brutalities were imitated. They don't understand the mass murders in the Balkans in the 1990s. These things are far out of our memory. So from the point of people today, it's what I've often heard, it's all political. The truth is somewhere in the middle. Everybody stop shooting. Israel's responsible. Hamas is responsible. Everybody, there's a moral fault of everybody, and nobody's right and nobody's wrong. That's where they begin. Now, that kind of horrible moral relativism leads a kind of a vacuum within that ends up in radical ideology. I want to talk more about that later. But tonight I want to go to a few things that people have said to me. What do I say when people say this? So first of all, I can't give you all the detail of what I know. I plan to do that in a course soon. But when someone says steal the land, I want you to think for a moment. Remember, Palestine is a region. It's the Rocky Mountains. It was never a state. So when someone says stole the land, from whom? From the Palestinians. Do you mean a Palestinian state? A Palestinian people? If they say Palestinian people, there was no identifiable Palestinian people until around the year 1900. Nobody called the residents of Palestine Palestinian. And if you were called a Palestinian, it was because you lived in Palestine. Therefore, anybody who lived in Palestine was called Palestinian, including the Jews. And if you left Palestine, you were no longer called a Palestinian. A Palestinian meant someone who lived in an administrative region called Palestine. Nobody owned it. Who owned it? Well, prior to the Romans, the Jews owned it, the Judeans. You see this in the New Testament. After that, the Romans owned it. Then the East Roman Empire, Byzantium, owned it until there was the invasion by the Arabs in the late 600s. Right? They took it from Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. They sent their colonists. They sent their settlers. They changed the language of the land. They imposed their religion. That's called history. Throughout history, there have been invasions and migrations, and I don't like to think about it, but that is the nature of human history. So nobody goes back and says, well, then the Arabs need to pull out of Byzantium. And the dozens of countries that the Arab Empire invaded and forcibly converted and imposed their language and their culture. We don't talk about all that. It's as if history suddenly began in 1948, and we don't talk about the rest of history before that. When the Arab Empire was defeated by the Ottoman Empire, it belonged to the Ottomans. Right? There was no, as it were, Palestinian state that had any control over their land. There were people who lived in an Ottoman administrative region called Palestine, whose borders change. I want to do that for you, but you can look this up. Maps of Palestine. You can go all the way back to the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. You can go back to the Arab Empire, the Byzantine Empire. It was an administrative district. In 1917, of course, after the defeat of the Ottomans, it was handed over to the British as an administrative district to manage until what we do next. Look at the map of Palestine and the British Mandate. It included the entire country of Jordan and beyond that. So when people say Palestine, do they mean Jordan? Do they mean all of what used to be the land of Israel? It was simply a British, a region that the British controlled until they knew what to do with it. It was not a people, it was not a nation. So when we say stealing the land from whom? When Jews began making aliyah during the Ottoman Empire, there was no land stolen. If anybody says land was stolen, ask them to show you what exactly was stolen. The Jews went in, they bought land from people in Palestine with the permission of the Turkish government. If anybody's responsible for the aliyah up until 1917, it was the Ottoman Turks. They permitted it. They managed the land sales. Now, from 1917 all the way until the British Mandate ended. If someone says to you, some Arab land was stolen, ask them to show you exactly which village, exactly which town. Ask them to show it to you. Everybody has a smartphone. Any land transfer that happened during the British Mandate was under the eyes of the British Mandate. I think it's obvious to most of us that by the end of the 1930s, the British Mandate tilted toward the Arab population of Palestine against the Jewish population of Palestine. There was no theft of land during the British Mandate. So if someone says the Jews stole the land, it was owned as it were by the Ottomans, owned by the British. There were two groups in Palestine, the Jews and the Arabs, and they fought a civil war in 1948. What was the civil war over? Sovereignty over land. When the UN came up with the partition in 1947, that wasn't the Jews. So when they say the Jews stole the land with the partition, blame the United Nations. The United Nations voted to divide Palestine into two groups, Jewish Palestinians and Arab Palestinians. I want you to think for a moment. What if Israel had named itself Palestine? They could have. They could have named themselves Jewish Palestine, the state of Israel and Palestine. If you think about this, if Israel had called itself Palestine, this trickery with words would not exist because everybody would be clear. Palestine's a region. There's Jewish Palestine and there's Arab Palestine. What are Israeli Arabs called? Israeli Arabs. They're not called Israeli Palestinians. They're not called Palestinian Israelis. Now, if they want to change that, that's fine. If they say to themselves they're Palestinian Israelis, what they're really saying is they identify with the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, what about during the War of 1948? I want you to remember, if anybody brings it up, it was a war over land. If you read any history, you can read what I'll call the Zionist histories or the so-called histories, for example, like Benny Morris, who is very critical of Israel, but it's a good history. Benny Morris, Morris. So it's a kind of it's a history that reacts against the heroic Zionist myth. It was troubling for me to read it, but I had to read it. But it's basically the same history, meaning it was a brutal war between two sides that wanted the same land. So during this war, by the way, you need to know, the Jewish settlements fought to the last person. They didn't run. There were very few surrenders. Sometimes when there were surrenders, people were massacred. So why is there a problem of Arab refugees? Because they relied on Arab armies to conquer what the UN had given to the Jews. It was a violation of the UN. So I want you to think about it this way. The Arab declaration of war against the newly founded state of Israel was an attempt to steal land that the United Nations had given to Israel. Now, they didn't accept it. They said there's no way that the UN can divide this. It's our land. There's no evidence that there's our land. You can't do a soil test that it's their land. If you did a DNA test of Palestinians, you're not going to see people who came from Arabia. You're going to see evidence of migration from Algeria and Egypt and so forth. This is again, I would never have ever given this talk before, but the myth of the Palestinian people is a myth that was created. The person today calls themselves Palestinian, fine. But if they say, I'm a Palestinian, and now there's war to take away the land from the Jewish state, and there's war to massacre Jews, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to oppose the premise that unfortunately, we've granted to them. And by the way, why have I always granted the premise of a Palestinian state, of Palestinian people? Because I was in favor of a two-state solution. I don't want one of the person who sounds like very right-wing and says there's no Palestinian people and they don't have a claim on the land. I wanted to be moderate. I'm still willing to be moderate, maybe to a fault. But I don't want to grab the premise that there was land that anybody else could steal. Because when they fled the land in 1948, it's as it were, Israel had won the war that they wanted to win. I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to think about this. If they had won that war, would there have been a Jewish refugee crisis? No. They could run to Gaza. They could run to the West Bank in 1948. They could go to Syria. They could go to Lebanon. Where could we have gone? Who would have saved us if they had won that war? There would be no refugee crisis. There would be another few hundred piles of hundreds of thousands of Jewish bodies lying in the extinguished state of Israel. That's what would have happened. Now, I don't like to talk this way. I don't like to rile things up. But I have to admit to myself, it was a war and we won, and if we had not won, we can't even imagine. They lost the war and they ran to Gaza, West Bank, and Lebanon, and so forth. If we would have lost the war, there would have been no refugee crisis. Why is there a refugee crisis? Because the state of Israel didn't do what they wanted to do, which is murder every one of us. By the way, if it would have been different, if this would have been Imperial Japan or Nazis, there would be no Arab refugees. They would have all been murdered. That's not who we were. So they tried to steal the land that the United Nations has given to Israel because there is no clear title to the land, claim to the land. It cannot be proven to anybody. It's just an axiom. It's just a premise. Now, when you go after now remember, they instigated the war in 1967, where Israel ended up occupying the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Go back and look at the history of after the 1967 war. Go look it up. What did Israel want to do immediately subsequent to the 1967 war? Trade land for peace. There was no desire to keep their land. We did not want to occupy their land. We did not want to be in charge of Palestinians or Arab Palestinians. They wouldn't take the deal. Their claim was, we won't accept a deal to create a Palestinian state. We want to eradicate you and murder every one of you. Keep that in mind. Ask yourself why Jordan, who had the West Bank, didn't create a Palestinian state. Why Egypt did not create a Palestinian state on the Gaza Strip. So if anybody says they stole the land, say, well, when they had the land, why didn't they have a state? When Egypt had Gaza, why didn't they have a state? The answer is because they only wanted a state on the bodies of Israelis. They would not accept a state until Israel was extinguished. There was never a desire for peace. So we look after 1967, someone said to me, I read somewhere, enormous number of land was taken from Palestinians on the West Bank. I looked it up. How many Palestinian villages on the West Bank were destroyed by the Israeli army after 1967? Okay. I found 7. When I finally got down to it, the names of 7 villages. Now I might be wrong. You can contest me. But Israelis did not go in 1967 and wipe out villages. Now, true, when they abandoned their villages in 1948, Israelis moved in. There's very little record that any Palestinian refugee in 1948 ever saw an Israeli soldier. They didn't fight, they ran. Why? Because the invading 7 Arab armies had said to them, you get out of the way, we'll slaughter the Israelis, we'll invite you back. Now, once they saw the war wasn't going their way, they regretted that. But if you look at the history of the I call it the Palestine Civil War of 48-49, there's no evidence of mass slaughters. Very few on each side. By the way, about the same number of Arabs there were mass murders by Israelis and mass murders of Israelis by the Arabs. About the same. Now, by the way, all total, which is astonishing for how brutal the war was, not more than a few thousand on each side. You can look up this history. Now, what happens is, of course, is Israel will focus on the massacres at Gush Etzion. Arabs will focus on the massacre at Deir Yassin. You look it up, it was actually rather infrequent. And there's evidence that when Arab villages stayed, there's a few times, yes, when for military reasons they pushed them out, they evacuated them. That's true. We can't hide from that. But it was a war on. And the Arab villages in the Israeli side, they had taken the side of the enemy, and Israel had to watch out for its own security. I wish wars were pure. I wish we could say it was a war of good against evil. I think so, but at a basic level, we have to understand this. As sad as it is, it was a war for land, a war of survival. And by the way, the Haganah, the Israelis were losing the war as of March 1948. You can look this up. Because they hadn't gone on the offensive. And there's what I would call the peace camp, that we can't go on the offensive. We can only live inside the borders the UN gave us. And there was the war camp that said, this is a war. If we don't take the battle to the enemy, they will destroy us. Quit trying to be so pure. This is what I'll call the war camp versus the peace camp in the Haganah in early 1948. Because of your desire for peace, we're going to be slaughtered. We have to take the battle to the enemy. It's a war, not a contest for moral superiority. It's a war. That being said, I would say as much as possible, the Haganah fought a moral war, as did the IDF after the founding of the state. You go to 1967. I look for the names of the villages that in 1967 that evicted the Arabs in the West Bank. Okay, I'll tell you something interesting. Of the 6-7 villages that I discovered, one was called Al-Jiflik. I said, that's interesting, because Al-Jiflik was across from our daughter Avigail's military base. Now, they said that town was destroyed, but when we went through the town, it was a thriving town. How could there be a destroyed city called Al-Jiflik, and on the other hand, a thriving town right across from our daughter's base? And by the way, you've heard us say this many times. Our daughter was a combat medic on an IDF base right across from Al-Jiflik. 90% of the people whom she treated were from Al-Jiflik, who would rather get treated on the driveway by Israeli paramedics on an Israeli military base than go to the hospital in Jericho. Now, we don't talk about that much, but there is, if I found one lie about the destroyed Arab village of Al-Jiflik, well, I have visual evidence because I was there, my wife was there, our daughter was there. It wasn't destroyed. Then you look at the names of those villages and you find out when you go to a different source that village where everybody was murdered as the Israelis stole their land had 6,000 people, then 8,000 people, then 10,000 people. You have probably heard this. If Israel had any kind of genocidal policy, how is it that the Palestinian population has only grown over all these years? And once the peace was relatively established, there were no evacuations, there were no stealing of land. So if anybody says land was stolen, ask them exactly which village where. If they say, no, in general the land was stolen, from whom? From the Turks? From the British during a war where they wanted to steal, if one can call it stealing land, stealing Israel? They lost a war. And that's where we're at today. They begin a war and don't like the consequences of losing the war and the strategy of inflicting terrible casualties and then calling a ceasefire has something that has been done over and over again. And once they call the ceasefire, then all the rhetoric comes up of the stolen land, the stolen land, the stolen land. I don't have any more sympathy. I have sympathy for innocent civilians everywhere, including Gaza, including the West Bank. I don't have any more sympathy for this claim that there's land stolen. It was called disputed land. There's disputed land because I want you to keep this in mind. When someone says stolen land, you have to say disputed land. What were they willing to do to the Jewish settlements? Destroy every one of them. Why? Because they say, we own all the land. I'm simply going to advocate that we say back to them, it's disputed land, maybe we own all the land. I never thought I'd say these words in my life. But I don't want to grant to the other side that it's their land which could be stolen. I'm going to say, let's just call it even it's disputed land, as in 1948. And what settles the issue of disputed land when each side denies the other one's claim? By the way, which Israel hasn't. Israel wanted a two-state solution. But we're going to go now down to their reality, just for a moment, just for thinking. Let's call it a disputed land. They claim all the land, and we claim all the land. That's where we seem to be now. Again, I don't think Israel wants all the land. Israel does not want to govern that many millions of Palestinians. But let's assume that's where we are today. How do you resolve disputed land? warfare. And that's what Hamas is devoted to. I'll talk about more of this about tomorrow. But for them, the occupation doesn't mean Gaza Strip. It doesn't mean the West Bank. It means the entire land of Israel. When they say occupation, you think of two regions. Hamas means everything. When they say free Palestine, they mean from the river, Jordan River, to the sea, eradicating, murdering every Jew. That's what they mean by the occupation. And if you look at the West Bank, I'll talk about this tomorrow, Israel wanted to give it back, did not want to be there. And again, there was so much terrorism and the idea of a Palestinian state on that close to Israel population centers. Israel is there not in order to occupy, but in order to defend. So my main advocacy for tonight is if someone says stole the land, you say, who owned the land? Ask somebody, who was the first president of Palestine? Was there an organized Palestinian state? Was there a Palestinian parliament? Was there any organization called Palestine that existed as something that could actually own land? It didn't exist. It's a myth that was created that the world has bought into. So I don't like to be this bellicose. I really don't. I really want to find peace. But our students are being pushed back by these narratives of stolen land. I like us to push back and say, it's disputed land. There's a war on. You tried several times. In 1948, you wanted to, in 1967, Hamas did it now. You've tried several times to get your land back one way or another. Okay, the war is on. Accept the consequences of war. Now, once we understand, and you really have to be rooted in this, there's no Palestinian people. It's an invention that came around about 1900. Palestine's a region, not a people. It's been owned by whoever owned the land, whatever empire owned the land, and they granted it to whoever they wanted. And to take modern ideology and retroject it back into history grants the argument. But I want us all, without mastering too much history, to be able to draw a line that when the other side makes a claim, you say, prove it. If they say it's our land, you say, prove it's your land. Prove that you had control of this land ever. If you say it's your land, go back and look at what each village owned. If a village owned it, you can call it the property of that village. But as far as owning the land outside of a village, it's eminent domain, which means it's owned by the state. I want to push this one step further. I've heard Palestinians say, we lost this percentage of the land when the British broke off Jordan. Well, that's the British. We lost this percentage of the land when the UN. That's the UN. But then I see the Negev in their claim. When was the Negev ever under any population of Arab Palestinians? Why did the UN give the Negev to Israel? Because they thought, well, the Palestinians, because they're contiguous to Jordan, they have access to the port of Aqaba. Israel's going to need its own port in Eilat, and they need a contiguous border all the way down there. There was no, as far as I know, no Arab villages in the Negev. If there were, they were very, very sparse. So how can that be claimed as Palestinian land? You know why they claim it? Because it was in the administrative district called Palestine. The Negev was in that administrative district, as was the entire country of Jordan. So people take the name of administrative district and they use it to claim land ownership. It's a complex idea. The more you study, the more it will be clear. But get it out of your head, especially your head, that there was any stealing of land. It was contested land. It was disputed land, and eventually a war declared by the other side to control the land, a war that they lost, and now they want to win it as a war of ideologue and idea. They've made progress in the United States of people under 35 on college campuses, and we have to start to push back against this idea.